When I bent down to pick up the book I'd dropped on the floor, I felt his presence before I saw him. Turning my head, I caught Liam standing there, his eyes fixed on me, and the way he looked at me made my breath catch. The moment was so brief, yet it felt like the room itself shifted. I had been cleaning the living room, humming absent-mindedly to the sound of the radio, when I accidentally knocked over one of my husband's old novels. The book had fallen just beneath the coffee table, and I crouched down, slipping my arm underneath to grab it. It was an ordinary movement in an ordinary day, until it wasn't. When I turned to see him standing in the doorway, I froze. Liam, my stepson, wasn't supposed to be home yet. He had mentioned heading out earlier that morning, camera slung over his shoulder as he rambled about finding the perfect light for his next project. Yet there he was, leaning against the frame of the doorway, his gaze fixed on me like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve. I noticed the stillness in the air, the kind that makes your pulse quicken for no reason at all. Liam didn't say a word, but his eyes lingered longer than they should have. It wasn't the kind of look you'd expect from your husband's son. No, this felt different. Something unspoken passed between us in that brief, uncomfortable silence. I stood up quickly, clutching the book to my chest as if it were some kind of shield. My cheeks burned, though I wasn't sure why. "I didn't hear you come in," I said, my voice faltering. He shrugged, but there was something unreadable in his expression. "Didn't mean to startle you," he replied, his tone casual, though his eyes betrayed him. The moment passed as quickly as it had come. Liam walked off toward the kitchen, leaving me standing there in the middle of the living room, gripping the book as though it might anchor me back to reality. I could hear him rummaging through the fridge, the mundane sounds grounding me just enough to shake off the haze of what had just happened. But the moment stuck with me. It played on a loop in my mind as I went about the rest of my chores. I caught myself staring into the mirror longer than usual that afternoon, scrutinizing my appearance in a way I hadn't in years. At 56, I had long since grown comfortable in my own skin, or so I thought. But now, a single glance from Liam had made me question everything. The distance in my marriage, my role in this family, and why, for the first time in years, I felt seen. I told myself I was imagining it, that the look in his eyes wasn't what it seemed, and that my reaction was nothing more than a symptom of boredom or loneliness. But even as I tried to convince myself, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered otherwise. Looking back, I should have known that moment would change everything. But at the time, I didn't see it coming. Not the tension, not the feelings, and certainly not the consequences. It started with small things. Subtle changes that I convinced myself didn't mean anything. After that moment in the living room, I couldn't stop replaying the way Liam had looked at me. It was as if he had seen me for the first time. Not as his father's wife, not as the woman who had stepped into his life when he was a teenager, but as something else. And maybe, just maybe, I hadn't entirely hated it. I tried to push it aside, telling myself it was my imagination running wild. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more those moments seemed to find me. The next one came just a few days later. I was making lunch, a quiet Saturday when my husband Richard had left early for a golf outing. I'd barely noticed Liam come into the kitchen until I turned around and found him standing closer than I expected. He was reaching for a glass in the cupboard above me, and for a moment we were so close I could feel the warmth of his body. "Sorry," he murmured, stepping back just slightly. But his voice had a low, almost intimate edge to it, like an afterthought. I laughed nervously, brushing past him as I grabbed a cutting board. "No problem," I said, but my hands trembled slightly as I chopped the vegetables for the salad. It was ridiculous how aware of him I had become. His movements, his presence, even the way he smelled faintly of cedarwood and something earthy. I chastised myself for noticing. He was just being polite, just helping himself to a glass of water. Nothing more. But then there was the way his eyes lingered when I spoke. The way his arm brushed against mine a little too often when we shared a small space. And the way he seemed to find excuses to be around me. I wasn't imagining it. At least, that's what I told myself as the days went on. One evening, about a week after that first moment in the living room, I found myself sitting on the back patio with a glass of wine. Richard was away again, this time on a business trip. He traveled often, leaving the house eerily quiet at night. Liam had been out for most of the day, but I heard the faint sound of the sliding glass door opening behind me. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him standing there with a beer in hand. He wasn't wearing a shirt, just a pair of gray sweatpants that hung low on his hips. The sight of him startled me. How grown he looked, how completely different from the boy I had met years ago. "Of course not," I said, forcing a smile and gesturing to the chair next to me. He sat down, and for a while, we just sat there in silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It should have been peaceful, but I felt anything but calm. The air between us felt heavy, charged with something I didn't want to name. "You seem different lately," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, but his words caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound casual as I sipped my wine. "I don't know, just quieter. Like you're lost in thought a lot," he said, glancing at me with those dark eyes that seemed to see right through me. "Is everything okay?" I hesitated. What was I supposed to say? That I'd been thinking about him far more than I should? That every time he was near, I felt like I was balancing on the edge of something dangerous? "I'm fine," I said finally. "Just busy, I guess." He nodded, but I could tell he didn't entirely believe me. "You know, if you ever need someone to talk to." He let the sentence trail off, his voice laced with a sincerity that made my chest ache. "I'll keep that in mind," I replied, offering him a small smile. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but the tension between us remained. When I went to bed that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at me again. The way he had seemed so attuned to my mood, to my emotions. It wasn't just my imagination anymore. Something was shifting between us, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could ignore it. The tipping point came on a rainy afternoon the following week. Richard was still out of town, and I had decided to spend the day reorganizing the storage closet in the hallway. It was tedious work, and I didn't notice Liam standing behind me until I felt his hand on my shoulder. I jumped slightly, startled. "You scared me," I said, laughing nervously as I turned to face him. "Sorry," he said, smiling faintly. "Didn't mean to sneak up on you." His hand lingered on my shoulder for a moment longer than necessary before he pulled it away. "Do you need any help?" he asked, his voice low and warm. I shook my head. "No, I've got it, but thanks." He didn't leave, though. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, watching me as I sorted through a box of old photographs. I felt his gaze on me, heavy and unwavering, and it made my hands tremble slightly as I worked. "You were really beautiful back then," he said suddenly, gesturing to a photo I had just pulled out of the box. It was an old picture of me in my 20s, smiling at the camera in a sundress. I felt my cheeks flush. "Thank you," I said softly, setting the photo aside. "You still are," he added, his voice quieter this time. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. The silence stretched between us, thick and almost unbearable. When I finally dared to look at him, the intensity in his eyes took my breath away. It wasn't just admiration, it was something deeper, something that made my pulse race and my stomach flip. I knew I should have said something, should have stopped whatever this was before it went any further. But I didn't. And that was the moment I knew I was in trouble. It happened late one night, a moment I hadn't planned for and one I'd spend countless hours afterward trying to rationalize. But deep down, I knew there was no rationale for what we did. Only raw emotion, desire, and the weight of everything we weren't supposed to feel. The house was quiet. Richard had called earlier to let me know he'd be extending his trip by another few days. By then, I had grown used to his absences, even welcomed the silence they brought. But that night, the silence felt heavy, like a presence in itself. I poured myself another glass of wine and sat on the couch, letting the faint glow of the television light up the otherwise dark room. I didn't expect to hear footsteps behind me. When I turned, I saw Liam standing at the edge of the living room, his hair damp from the shower, a plain t-shirt clinging to his chest. He held a mug in his hand, but his eyes were on me. "You're up late," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He shrugged, stepping further into the room. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd make some tea." "Good idea," I murmured, turning my attention back to the screen. But I could feel him watching me, the weight of his presence impossible to ignore. Instead of going back to his room, Liam crossed the room and sat on the couch, just a few feet away from me. The space between us felt smaller than it should have. For a while, neither of us spoke, the low hum of the TV filling the room. I could feel his body heat, his closeness amplifying the tension that had been building between us for weeks. "What are you watching?" he asked, breaking the silence. I glanced at the screen, realizing I hadn't been paying attention. "Some old movie," I said. "Nothing special." He smiled faintly, his gaze lingering on me in a way that made my pulse quicken. "You look beautiful tonight," he said, his voice low. I froze, the words hitting me like a jolt of electricity. I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't. Instead, I looked down at the glass in my hands, my heart pounding so loudly, I was certain he could hear it. "You don't have to pretend you didn't hear me," he said after a moment. "I meant it." "Liam," I began, my voice shaky. "You can't." "Why not?" he interrupted gently, leaning forward. "You think I haven't noticed the way you've been looking at me, or the way I can't stop thinking about you?" I opened my mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Because he was right. I had been looking at him, thinking about him, wanting him in ways I couldn't admit, not even to myself. And now, sitting so close to him in the dim light of the living room, I felt the walls I had carefully built around my emotions beginning to crumble. This isn't right," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "But it doesn't feel wrong, does it?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, the rest of the world seemed to disappear. I don't know who moved first, whether it was me or him, but the next thing I knew, his lips were on mine, warm and urgent. I should have pulled away. I should have stopped it. But I didn't. Instead, I kissed him back, my hands trembling as they found their way to his shoulders. The kiss deepened, the air around us thick with unspoken need. When he pulled back, his forehead resting against mine, I could see the conflict in his eyes. But there was something else there too, something that mirrored the way I felt. "Evelyn," he murmured, his voice breaking the silence. Hearing him say my name like that with so much tenderness made my resolve falter even further. I didn't say anything, because I didn't trust myself to speak. Instead, I stood up, my hands trembling as I set my wine glass on the coffee table. Without a word, I walked out of the living room and up the stairs, my heart racing with every step. But I didn't go to my bedroom. Instead, I stopped outside the guest room Liam had been staying in since he moved back home. For a long moment, I just stood there, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. I should have gone to bed, shut the door, and pretended none of it had happened. But I didn't. That night marked the beginning of something we couldn't undo. It wasn't just about the physical connection, though that was undeniable. It was the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. For the first time in a long time, I felt wanted, seen. And it was intoxicating. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered confessions. We were careful at first, meeting late at night when Richard was out or sneaking glances across the room when we thought no one was watching. Each touch, each kiss, felt like a secret only we could share. One afternoon, we found ourselves alone again. I had been in the kitchen, cleaning up after lunch, when Liam walked in. The sun streaming through the window cast a warm glow over the room, but the tension between us made the air feel heavy. He stood behind me, his presence undeniable. I could feel the heat of his body, even though he didn't touch me. "Evelyn," he said softly, his voice sending a shiver down my spine. I turned to face him, my breath catching when I saw the way he was looking at me. Before I could say anything, he closed the distance between us, his hands finding my waist as he kissed me with a hunger that took my breath away. We began finding more excuses to be alone. A quiet walk around the neighborhood. An afternoon trip to the farmer's market, where we pretended to be nothing more than a stepmother and stepson running errands. But every touch, every glance, told a different story. It wasn't long before the secrecy became a thrill in itself. We met in places we shouldn't have. An empty guest room at a family gathering. The backseat of his car parked in a secluded spot by the lake. Each moment was a risk, but that was part of what made it so intoxicating. But with every stolen moment, the reality of our situation loomed over us. We were playing with fire, and we both knew it. There were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long we could keep it up before everything came crashing down. And yet, even as the guilt gnawed at me, I couldn't bring myself to stop, because what we had, what Liam and I shared, was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just desire, it was connection, understanding, and something I didn't dare call love, at least, not yet. For weeks Liam and I danced on the edge of discovery. Every glance across the room, every fleeting touch when no one was looking, felt like a risk. But the thrill of it, the danger, only made it harder to stop. I tried to act normal around Richard, as if nothing had changed, but I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep up the charade. Every moment with Liam chipped away at my carefully constructed facade. It wasn't just the fear of being caught that made things complicated. There was a shift in Liam, too. At first he seemed content with our stolen moments, but as the weeks went on, I began to sense a restlessness in him. He wanted more, though he never said it outright. It was in the way he lingered when we said goodbye, the way he looked at me like he was trying to memorize every detail of my face. One evening, things came to a head. Richard had returned from his trip, and the three of us were sitting in the living room after dinner. Richard was flipping through the channels, barely paying attention to the conversation. Liam was seated across from me, and I could feel his eyes on me, even as I tried to avoid looking at him. "Liam," Richard said, breaking the silence, "how's the photography work going?" "I've been meaning to ask." "It's going well," Liam replied, his voice steady, though I could hear the underlying tension. "I've been working on a series for a client, portraits mostly." "That's great," Richard said, nodding. "You should show us some of your work sometime." Liam glanced at me, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "Maybe I will," he said, his tone measured. The conversation moved on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Liam was holding something back. Later that night, after Richard had gone to bed, I found Liam sitting on the back patio, a cigarette in hand. He rarely smoked, and seeing him like that made my chest tighten. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked softly as I stepped outside. He looked up at me, his eyes dark and tired. "Something like that." I hesitated for a moment before sitting down beside him. The air was cool, and the faint scent of smoke lingered between us. "What's wrong?" I asked. He took a drag from his cigarette, exhaling slowly before he spoke. "I hate this," he said, his voice low. "Hiding, pretending like there's nothing going on." I felt a pang of guilt at his words. "Liam, we don't have a choice, you know that." He turned to look at me, his gaze intense. "But what if we did? What if we stopped pretending?" I didn't know how to respond. The idea of being honest, of laying everything bare, was terrifying. I couldn't imagine what would happen if Richard found out, or if anyone else did. The fallout would be catastrophic. "We can't," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's not that simple." He shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "It never is with you, is it?" The words stung, but I couldn't blame him for feeling that way. He stood up, flicking his cigarette into the ashtray before walking back inside, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The tension between us only grew after that night. Liam became more distant, his frustration evident in the way he avoided me when we weren't alone. It hurt, but I knew he was right to be angry. I had been the one to start this, the one to cross the line, and now I was the one holding us back. Things took an unexpected turn when Claire, my best friend, came to visit. Claire had been a part of my life for years, and she had a knack for noticing things most people wouldn't. The moment she stepped into the house, I felt a wave of anxiety. I hadn't told her anything about Liam, of course, but I couldn't shake the fear that she might pick up on something. "You've been quiet lately," she said over coffee one morning. "Is everything okay?" I forced a smile, hoping it didn't look as strained as it felt. "I'm fine, just a lot on my mind." Claire narrowed her eyes at me, her expression skeptical. "You know you can talk to me, right? If something's going on." "Of course," I said quickly. "It's nothing really." She didn't look convinced, but she let it go. Still, her presence added another layer of tension to an already fragile situation. Liam was careful around her, keeping his distance whenever she was in the room. But I noticed the way he looked at me when he thought no one was watching. The same way he always did. Things came to a boiling point one evening when Liam and I were alone in the kitchen. Claire and Richard had gone out for a drink, leaving the house quiet, except for the sound of the rain outside. I was washing dishes when I felt Liam's presence behind me. "Evelyn?" he said softly, his voice sending a shiver down my spine. I turned to face him, my hands still wet from the sink. "What is it?" He hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't keep pretending like this doesn't mean anything." "It does mean something," I said, my voice breaking. "You know it does." "Then why are we still hiding?" he asked, his frustration evident. "Why can't we just be honest about what we feel?" "Because it would destroy everything," I said, my chest tightening. "Do you really think Richard would just accept this? Do you think anyone would?" "I don't care what anyone thinks," he said, his voice rising. "I care about you." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I felt my resolve crumbling, the weight of everything we had been hiding threatening to crush me. But before I could respond, the sound of the front door opening broke the moment. Richard and Claire were back, their laughter echoing through the hallway. Liam stepped back, his expression a mixture of anger and longing. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with the sound of my racing heartbeat. It was later that week when the first real complication arose. Liam had been working on a photography project for a local gallery, and one of his subjects, a woman named Julia, had taken a particular interest in him. I didn't know much about her, but the way he talked about her made me uneasy. I couldn't tell if it was jealousy or something else, but I felt a knot in my stomach every time her name came up. Then, one evening, Liam mentioned that Julia had invited him to a gallery opening. "You should come," he said casually, though his eyes betrayed a hint of something more. I hesitated, unsure if it was a good idea. But part of me wanted to see who this woman was and what she meant to him. The gallery opening was beautiful, filled with people milling about and admiring the art. Julia was charming, with a sharp wit and an easy laugh that made me feel instantly out of place. She greeted Liam warmly, her hand lingering on his arm just a little too long. I tried to focus on the art, but my attention kept drifting back to them. Liam caught my eye more than once, his expression unreadable. By the end of the night, I felt more conflicted than ever. The lines between us were blurring, and I wasn't sure how much longer we could keep walking this tightrope without falling. The gallery opening was the beginning of the unraveling. I didn't know it at the time, but that night set in motion events that would change everything. As much as I tried to brush off my discomfort, the image of Liam and Julia laughing together haunted me. It wasn't just jealousy, it was the realization that this wasn't sustainable. The secrecy, the tension, the stolen moments, it all felt like a ticking time bomb, waiting to explode. But it wasn't jealousy or guilt that ultimately tipped the scales. It was something much darker. A week later, the first sign of trouble appeared. It started with a knock at the door. Unexpected and urgent. I was alone at the time. Richard was at work, and Liam had gone out to run errands. When I opened the door, I found a man standing there, his expression cold and unreadable. He was dressed plainly, jeans, a jacket, but there was something about him that sent a chill down my spine. "Mrs. Clark?" he asked, his voice firm. "Yes," I replied, my heart pounding. "Can I help you?" "I'm Detective Marcus Hayes," he said, pulling out a badge. "I'm investigating a case that may involve someone in your household. Would you mind answering a few questions?" My stomach dropped. "What kind of case?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's regarding a series of incidents in the area," he said vaguely. "I'd prefer to discuss it in private." I hesitated before stepping aside to let him in. He sat at the dining table, pulling out a notebook. "I understand your stepson Liam is staying here?" "Yes," I said cautiously. "What's this about?" He flipped through his notebook, his expression unreadable. "Has he mentioned anyone by the name of Julia Baker?" The name hit me like a slap. "Julia?" I repeated, my voice faltering. "He knows her, yes? Why?" "She was found dead 2 nights ago," he said bluntly. "We're trying to determine the circumstances surrounding her death." For a moment I couldn't speak. My mind raced, trying to process what he had just said. "Dead?" I managed to whisper. "What happened?" "An apparent overdose," he said. "But there are irregularities. Liam was seen with her the night before and we're trying to piece together a timeline. I felt the blood drain from my face. Liam would never. He's not involved in something like this. I'm not accusing him, Hayes said calmly. I'm just gathering information. Can you tell me anything about his relationship with her? I shook my head. They worked together on his photography project. That's all I know. He nodded, scribbling something in his notebook. If you hear from him or remember anything that might help, please let me know. He left shortly after, but the weight of his visit lingered. When Liam returned home that evening, I confronted him immediately. Liam, I said, my voice sharp, we need to talk. He looked startled, setting down the bag of groceries he was carrying. What's wrong? A detective came by today, I said. He's investigating Julia's death. Liam's face paled. Julia's dead? Don't act like you didn't know, I snapped. They saw you with her the night before. What happened? He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the kitchen. I didn't do anything, Evelyn. I swear. We went to the gallery together, had a few drinks, and then she went home. That's the last I saw her. Then why are they asking questions about you? I demanded. Is there something you're not telling me? He stopped pacing, turning to face me. I don't know, he said, his voice trembling. But I didn't hurt her. You have to believe me. I wanted to believe him. But the look in his eyes, part fear, part desperation, made me wonder if there was more to the story than he was letting on. Over the next few days, the tension in the house was unbearable. Liam avoided me, spending most of his time locked in his room. Richard noticed the change in him, but assumed it was related to his work. I, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the brink of disaster. It wasn't until I found the camera that everything came crashing down. I had gone into Liam's room to grab some laundry, a mundane task I'd done countless times before. But when I saw the camera sitting on his desk, something compelled me to pick it up. The memory card was still inside, and before I could stop myself, I plugged it into my laptop. What I saw made my blood run cold. The photos were of Julia, taken the night of the gallery opening. At first, they seemed innocent, candid shots of her laughing, sipping her drink. But as I scrolled further, the images became darker. There was one of her passed out on a couch, her face pale and lifeless. Another showed Liam standing over her, his expression unreadable. I felt sick. My hands trembled as I closed the laptop, my mind racing. I didn't want to believe what I had just seen. But the evidence was undeniable. Liam had been there when Julia died, and he had documented it. When Liam came home that evening, I confronted him again, this time with the photos. What is this? I demanded, shoving the laptop toward him. He froze, his face a mask of panic. Where did you find that? That's not the point, I snapped. You were there, Liam. You saw her like that, and you didn't tell anyone. Why? He looked down, his shoulders slumping. I didn't know what to do, he said quietly. She overdosed right in front of me. I panicked. I didn't think anyone would believe me. So you took pictures instead of calling for help? I said, my voice rising. Do you realize how bad this looks? I didn't hurt her, he said, his voice desperate. I swear, Evelyn, I didn't touch her. I wanted to believe him, but the photos told a different story. And now I was caught in the middle of a nightmare I couldn't escape. The days that followed were a blur of fear and uncertainty. Detective Hayes returned, asking more questions about Liam. I lied, covering for him even as my doubts grew. I couldn't bring myself to turn him in. Not when I still wasn't sure of the truth, but the weight of what I was hiding was crushing me. Richard, oblivious to everything, continued on as if nothing was wrong. But I could see the cracks forming in our lives, the lies threatening to tear everything apart. Then, one night, everything came to a head. Liam came to me, his face pale and his hands shaking. They're coming for me, he said. I heard from a friend. Hayes has enough to arrest me. Liam, I began, but he cut me off. I need your help, he said. I can't do this alone. I didn't know what to say. The man I had fallen for, the man I thought I knew, was slipping through my fingers, and as much as I wanted to save him, I didn't know if I could. I stared at Liam, his face pale and pleading, and felt like the ground beneath me was shifting. He was asking for my help, asking me to risk everything to protect him, and the worst part was, I still didn't know if he was innocent. What do you want me to do? I asked, my voice shaking. He paced the room, running his hands through his hair. I need to get out of here, he said. I can't wait around for them to arrest me. They'll twist everything. The photos, the fact that I didn't call the cops. I'll go to prison, Evelyn, and you know I didn't do anything wrong. You don't know that running will make it better, I said, my mind racing. If you leave, it'll only make you look guilty. Do you think they care whether I look guilty or not? He snapped, his voice breaking. They've already made up their minds. Hayes is just waiting for the right moment to pounce. I couldn't argue with him. Detective Hayes had been relentless, his questions cutting deeper with every visit. I'd done my best to shield Liam, but I knew it wasn't enough. The evidence was damning, and I couldn't deny the doubts creeping into my own mind. But then I looked at him, at the fear in his eyes, the desperation in his voice, and I knew I couldn't abandon him. No matter what he had or hadn't done, I couldn't walk away now. I was in this too deep. What's your plan? I asked finally, the words heavy on my tongue. The next 24 hours were a blur of frantic planning. Liam wanted to leave town, at least until things cooled down. I tried to convince him to stay, to face the accusations head-on, but he was adamant. I can't fight this from behind bars, he said. I need time to figure out my next move. I didn't know if I was making the right choice by helping him, but at that point, it didn't matter. My loyalty to him had already cost me too much, my peace of mind, my sense of morality, and whatever was left of my marriage. What was one more step down this dark path? That night, while Richard slept, I packed a bag for Liam and handed him some cash I'd stashed away for emergencies. Take this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You'll need it. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching mine. Thank you, he said softly. I'll make this right, I promise. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I watched as he slipped out the back door, the shadows swallowing him whole. And just like that, he was gone. The next morning, the consequences of my actions began to take shape. Detective Hayes arrived again, this time with a warrant. Richard was home, and the sight of the police at our doorstep sent him into a fury. What the hell is going on, Evelyn? He demanded as Hayes and his team searched the house. I don't know, I lied, my heart pounding. They're investigating Liam, something about that woman he worked with. Richard's face turned red with anger. And you didn't think to tell me. Jesus, Evelyn, what else are you hiding? I couldn't answer him. The guilt was suffocating, but I couldn't let it show. Not now. Hayes found the memory card Liam had left behind, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they pieced together what had happened. But they wouldn't find him. Not yet. And that gave me some small measure of relief. The days that followed were a whirlwind of tension and suspicion. Richard became colder, his trust in me clearly shattered. I couldn't blame him. I had lied to his face, betrayed his family, and for what? A love I couldn't even define? A man who might not be who I thought he was? I spent most of my time alone, replaying everything that had happened in my mind. I thought about Liam, about the way he had looked at me that first night on the patio. I thought about Julia, about the photos and the questions they raised, and I thought about Hayes, who seemed to be closing in with every passing day. Then, one evening, the phone rang. It was an unknown number, but I knew who it was before I even picked up. Evelyn. Liam's voice came through the line, low and urgent. I need your help. My heart skipped a beat. Liam, where are you? I can't tell you, he said. But I think I know who's behind all this. Julia was mixed up with someone dangerous. They're the ones who set me up. Who? I asked, my voice trembling. Liam, what are you talking about? I don't have time to explain, he said. But I need you to meet me. There's something I need to show you. Liam, please, he interrupted, his voice cracking. I can't do this without you. Against my better judgment, I agreed. He gave me a location, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, and told me to come alone. Every instinct in my body screamed that this was a bad idea, but I couldn't turn him away. Not now. The warehouse was dark and empty, the air thick with the smell of oil and rust. I found Liam waiting for me near the back, his face gaunt and tired. He was holding a folder, which he handed to me without a word. What is this? I asked, opening it. Inside were documents, photos, and emails, evidence that Julia had been involved in a blackmail scheme targeting wealthy clients of Liam's gallery. It was clear she had been working with someone else, though their identity wasn't immediately apparent. This proves I didn't kill her, Liam said. She was playing a dangerous game, and it caught up with her. But why did they frame you? I asked, my mind racing. Because I found out about it, he said. She told me everything that night, and someone didn't want me to talk. Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. My heart leapt into my throat as a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness. It was Detective Hayes. Well, well, he said, his voice dripping with smugness. This is quite the little reunion. Liam tensed, stepping in front of me. What are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing, Hayes said, pulling out his gun. You've been a thorn in my side for weeks, kid, but this ends now. Hayes found the memory card Liam had left behind, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they pieced together what had happened. But they wouldn't find him. Not yet, and that gave me some small measure of relief. The days that followed were a whirlwind of tension and suspicion. Richard became colder, his trust in me clearly shattered. I couldn't blame him. I had lied to his face, betrayed his family, and for what? A love I couldn't even define? A man who might not be who I thought he was? I spent most of my time alone, replaying everything that had happened in my mind. I thought about Liam, about the way he had looked at me that first night on the patio. I thought about Julia, about the photos and the questions they raised. And I thought about Hayes, who seemed to be closing in with every passing day. Then, one evening, the phone rang. It was an unknown number, but I knew who it was before I even picked up. Evelyn? Liam's voice came through the line, low and urgent. I need your help. My heart skipped a beat. Liam, where are you? I can't tell you, he said, but I think I know who's behind all this. Julia was mixed up with someone dangerous. They're the ones who set me up. Who? I asked, my voice trembling. Liam, what are you talking about? I don't have time to explain, he said, but I need you to meet me. There's something I need to show you. Liam, please, he interrupted, his voice cracking. I can't do this without you. Against my better judgment, I agreed. He gave me a location, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, and told me to come alone. Every instinct in my body screamed that this was a bad idea, but I couldn't turn him away. Not now. The warehouse was dark and empty, the air thick with the smell of oil and rust. I found Liam waiting for me near the back, his face gaunt and tired. He was holding a folder, which he handed to me without a word. What is this? I asked, opening it. Inside were documents, photos, and emails, evidence that Julia had been involved in a blackmail scheme targeting wealthy clients of Liam's gallery. It was clear she had been working with someone else, though their identity wasn't immediately apparent. This proves I didn't kill her, Liam said. She was playing a dangerous game, and it caught up with her. But why did they frame you? I asked, my mind racing. Because I found out about it, he said. She told me everything that night, and someone didn't want me to talk. Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. My heart leapt into my throat as a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness. It was Detective Hayes. Well, well, he said, his voice dripping with smugness. This is quite the little reunion. Liam tensed, stepping in front of me. What are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing, Hayes said, pulling out his gun. You've been a thorn in my side for weeks, kid, but this ends now. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan overhead. I sat cross-legged on the edge of my bed, an old wooden box resting on my lap. My fingers brushed over the intricate carvings on its lid, the weight of the moment heavy in my chest. Inside the box were fragments of a life I had long since tucked away. Letters, photographs, and little mementos that once held meaning, but now felt like relics from another world. I hadn't opened it in years, but something about tonight had driven me to pull it out from the back of my closet. I took a deep breath and lifted the lid. The familiar scent of aged paper wafted up, and my chest tightened as I reached for the first letter. Bill's handwriting stared back at me, the lines neat and deliberate, each word a reminder of the love we had shared. Evelyn, my beautiful Evelyn. I stopped reading, the lump in my throat making it impossible to continue. I didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway, didn't register the faint creak of the door until it was too late. Evelyn? My heart jumped, and I scrambled to close the box, nearly dropping it in the process. Andrew stood in the doorway, his hand still on the doorknob, his expression caught somewhere between curiosity and concern. He hesitated, his eyes darting to the box in my lap. I didn't mean to barge in. The door was open. I forced a smile, though my hands trembled as I clutched the box. It's fine. I just wasn't expecting anyone. Andrew stepped inside, his movements slow and cautious. Are you okay? I'm fine, I said quickly, too quickly. Just going through some old things. His gaze lingered on me for a moment before shifting to the box. What's in there? Nothing, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Just memories. He didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he moved to sit on the edge of the bed, his presence filling the room in a way that made my chest tighten. I didn't mean to interrupt, he said softly. You didn't, I lied, my hands gripping the edges of the box as if it might anchor me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and charged, until Andrew finally broke it. Do you ever miss him? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question caught me off guard, and I felt my throat tighten. Every day, I admitted. He nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands. Me too. There was something about the way he said it, the quiet vulnerability in his voice, that made my heart ache. I reached out instinctively, my hand brushing against his arm. He was proud of you, you know, I said softly. He always said you were going to do great things. Andrew looked up at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. And you? He asked. What do you think? The question hung in the air, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I think he was right, I said finally. A small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, and for a moment the tension in the room eased. But it was still there, simmering beneath the surface, an unspoken weight that neither of us seemed ready to confront. When Andrew finally stood to leave, the room felt colder without him. I'll let you get back to whatever that is, he said, gesturing toward the box. Thank you, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He paused in the doorway, his hand on the frame. Evelyn? Yes? If you ever need to talk about anything, I'm here. I nodded, my chest tightening as I watched him leave. I know. That night, as I sat alone in the quiet of my bedroom, the box still resting on my lap, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Andrew had always been kind, always attentive. But tonight, there had been something different in his gaze, something unspoken, but undeniable. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to ignore it. The morning after Andrew walked in on me, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me before leaving. His words had been simple, almost casual, but there had been something beneath them, a kind of unspoken understanding that lingered long after he'd gone. I told myself I was overthinking it. Andrew was just being kind, the way he always was. But as I stood in the kitchen making coffee, I couldn't shake the memory of his eyes, the quiet intensity in them, that had left me feeling exposed in a way I hadn't expected. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway snapped me out of my thoughts. I glanced out the window to see Andrew's truck parked in front of the house. What now? I muttered under my breath, though my heart quickened as I wiped my hands on a dish towel and moved to open the door. Andrew stood on the porch, holding a brown paper bag in one hand and a confident grin on his face. Morning, he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Morning, I replied, crossing my arms. What are you doing here? Thought I'd bring breakfast, he said, holding up the bag. Figured you might not have eaten yet. I raised an eyebrow but didn't argue, stepping aside to let him into the kitchen. He set the bag down on the counter and started unpacking its contents: croissants, fruit, and 2 steaming cups of coffee. You didn't have to do this, I said, though I couldn't deny the warmth spreading through my chest at the gesture. I wanted to, he replied simply, handing me a coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, the morning light streaming through the windows. Andrew leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, but his eyes held that same quiet intensity from the night before. So, what were you really doing with that box? He asked, his tone casual but curious. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around my coffee cup. Just reminiscing, I said finally. About Dad? Yes, I admitted. He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. You don't talk about him much. It's not easy, I said softly. There are days when it still feels like he's just out running an errand and will walk through the door any minute. Andrew reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was brief, but it sent a jolt through me. "You don't have to go through this alone, you know," he said gently. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of easy conversation and quiet moments. Andrew stayed longer than necessary, helping me clean up the kitchen and fix a squeaky cabinet door that had been bothering me for weeks. At one point, as he knelt to tighten a screw, I reached past him to grab a dish towel from the counter. Our shoulders brushed, and I felt a spark shoot through me, sharp and unexpected. Andrew paused, glancing up at me, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. "Sorry," I said quickly, stepping back. "It's fine," he replied, though his voice was quieter now, his eyes lingering on mine a second too long before he turned back to the cabinet. Later that afternoon, as I stood by the window watching Andrew's truck disappear down the driveway, I felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. Gratitude for his kindness, confusion over the tension that seemed to grow stronger with every visit, and something else, something I wasn't ready to name. That night, I found myself sitting in the living room, a book open on my lap that I wasn't really reading. The house felt quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that pressed down on me like a weight. When my phone buzzed on the coffee table, I picked it up to see Andrew's name on the screen. "Andrew. Didn't mean to stay so long today. Hope I didn't get in the way." I stared at the message for a moment before typing a reply. "Me, you didn't. It was nice to have company." His response came almost immediately. "Andrew, good. Let me know if you ever need anything. Anytime." I set the phone down, my chest tightening at the sincerity in his words. It wasn't just his presence that lingered. It was the way he made me feel, like I wasn't as alone as I had convinced myself I was. And that, more than anything, was what scared me. The next time Andrew stopped by, it was under the guise of fixing a leaky faucet in the bathroom. I knew it didn't really need fixing, but I didn't call him out on it. As he worked, I stood in the doorway, watching him with a mix of curiosity and unease. He moved with the same quiet confidence I had always admired, his focus so intent that he didn't seem to notice me staring. But when he finished and turned to face me, the look in his eyes made my breath catch. "All done," he said, his voice soft. "Thank you," I replied, though my voice came out quieter than I intended. Andrew stepped closer, his gaze steady on mine. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I like being here." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. There was something in his tone, something raw and unguarded, that left me feeling exposed in a way I couldn't explain. That night, as I lay in bed, the memory of his words echoed in my mind. I like being here. And for the first time in years, I let myself admit that I liked it too. Over the next week, Andrew's visits became a regular part of my days. He showed up with bags of groceries, tools for fixing things I hadn't even realized were broken, or just himself, and an easy excuse to stay a while. I told myself it was nothing unusual. Andrew had always been attentive, always cared in that easygoing way of his. But the way he lingered now, the way his hand brushed mine when he handed me something, the way his eyes held mine just a little too long, it all felt different. It was in the small moments, the unspoken gestures, that I felt something begin to shift. One afternoon, he showed up with a small bag of flower bulbs. "Thought these might look nice by the front steps," he said, holding them up with a grin. I laughed, though the sound felt nervous even to me. "Are you taking over my gardening duties now?" "Just trying to help," he replied, setting the bag down on the porch. Before I could protest, he grabbed a trowel from the shed and began digging a small trench along the edge of the walkway. I stood nearby, watching him work with an efficiency that made me smile despite myself. "You didn't have to do this," I said softly. He glanced up at me, his hands covered in dirt, his expression serious. "I like helping you," he said simply. The sincerity in his voice made my chest tighten, and I looked away, focusing on the flower bulbs in my hands. As we worked side by side, the conversation turned to lighter topics: his work, the weather, a funny story about his neighbor's overly curious dog. But beneath the easy banter, there was a quiet tension I couldn't ignore. At one point, as I leaned forward to hand him a bulb, our hands brushed. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me. I glanced at him, and the look in his eyes made my breath catch. "Sorry," he murmured, though he didn't pull away immediately. It's fine, I said quickly, stepping back to put some distance between us. But the moment lingered, the air between us charged with something unspoken. That evening, as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, we sat together on the porch steps, sipping lemonade and admiring our handiwork. The freshly planted bulbs were neatly arranged, the soil dark and rich against the fading light. "Looks good," Andrew said, his voice quiet. "It does," I agreed, though my attention was more on him than the flowers. The silence between us stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable. I could feel the warmth of his presence beside me, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Evelyn," he said softly, breaking the quiet. I turned to look at him, my chest tightening at the way he was watching me, like he was trying to figure out how to say something he wasn't sure he should. "What is it?" I asked. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands. "Do you ever feel like you're just going through the motions?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "Yes," I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "More often than I'd like to admit." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "Me too." His honesty made something inside me ache. I reached out instinctively, my hand brushing against his arm. "You're not alone," I said softly. Andrew looked at me, his eyes filled with something raw and unguarded. "Neither are you," he said. The weight of his words hung between us, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The next day, Andrew showed up again, this time with dinner from our favorite Italian place. "I figured you shouldn't have to cook tonight," he said, setting the bags down on the counter. I laughed, shaking my head. "You're spoiling me." "Maybe you deserve to be spoiled," he replied, his tone teasing but his eyes serious. The comment made my cheeks flush, and I turned away, pretending to busy myself with plates and silverware. We ate at the dining room table, the soft glow of the chandelier casting warm shadows on the walls. The conversation was light at first, but as the evening wore on, it turned more introspective. Andrew talked about his father, about how much he missed him, and about the pressure he felt to live up to his expectations. "I always thought I had more time with him," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I reached across the table, my hand covering his. "He was so proud of you," I said softly. "You know that, right?" Andrew nodded, his gaze dropping to our joined hands. "And what about you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What about me?" I asked, confused. "Are you proud of me?" The vulnerability in his question made my chest tighten, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "Of course I am," I said. The look on his face was one of quiet relief, and I realized then how much my opinion mattered to him. After dinner, as we cleaned up the kitchen, the closeness between us felt almost unbearable. Every time he reached past me to grab a plate or a towel, our bodies brushed, and the air between us grew heavier with unspoken tension. At one point, as I reached for a dish on the counter, Andrew's hand covered mine. I froze, my breath catching as I turned to look at him. "Evelyn," he said softly, his voice trembling slightly. "Yes?" He didn't say anything else. Instead, he leaned in, his lips brushing against my cheek in a gesture so brief and tentative that it could almost have been mistaken for an accident. Almost. When he pulled back, his eyes searched mine, his expression both apologetic and hopeful. "I should go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, though my chest ached at the thought of him leaving. "Okay." As he walked to the door, he hesitated, his hand on the knob. "Good night, Evelyn," he said, his voice soft. "Good night," I replied. And then he was gone, leaving me alone in a house that suddenly felt too quiet, too big, and too full of possibilities I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The night after Andrew kissed my cheek, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing there in the kitchen. The softness in his voice when he said my name, the hesitation in his eyes before he walked out the door. It wasn't just the kiss, though that alone had left my heart racing. It was everything else. The way he looked at me, the quiet assurance in his presence, the way he made me feel seen, in a way I hadn't been in years. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew better. And that scared me. The next evening, Andrew came by unannounced again. This time, he brought a bottle of wine. "I thought you might need a break," he said, holding it up with a crooked smile. I stared at him for a moment, unsure of what to say. "You really don't take no for an answer, do you?" "Not when it comes to you," he replied, his tone light but his eyes steady. I stepped aside to let him in, my heart pounding as he walked past me into the kitchen. We sat on the couch, the wine bottle half empty on the coffee table between us. The TV was on, but neither of us was really paying attention. Andrew leaned back, his arm draped casually over the back of the couch, his gaze fixed on me. "You've been quiet," he said. "I've been thinking," I replied, though the truth was I'd been trying not to think at all. "About what?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. I hesitated, my fingers twisting in my lap. "About us," I admitted finally. His expression didn't change, but I saw the faintest flicker of something in his eyes. Relief, maybe, or hope. And I don't know what to do," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Andrew shifted closer, his arm brushing against mine. "You don't have to do anything," he said softly. "Just let this be what it is." "And what is it?" I asked, turning to look at him. "It's real," he said simply. The honesty in his voice made my chest tighten, and before I could stop myself, I reached for his hand. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I know," he said, his fingers curling around mine. "But you don't have to be." The air between us grew heavier, the silence stretching as we sat there, neither of us willing to break the moment. Then, without thinking, I leaned toward him. It wasn't planned or deliberate, it was instinct, a pull I couldn't resist. When our lips met, it was soft at first, tentative, as if we were both afraid of what might happen if we gave in completely. But then Andrew's hand slid to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and the kiss deepened, growing more urgent. His other hand rested on my waist, steadying me as I moved closer, my hands gripping his shirt as if to anchor myself. Every rational thought vanished, replaced by the overwhelming heat of his touch and the dizzying sensation of being wanted in a way I hadn't felt in so long. Somehow, we ended up in my bedroom. I couldn't remember how we got there, only the way his hands moved over me with a reverence that made my heart ache. He paused, his forehead resting against mine as he whispered, "Are you sure?" "Yes," I breathed, my voice trembling but certain. The next moments blurred into a haze of warmth and connection, every kiss and touch weaving a story of its own. Andrew was gentle but insistent, his hands and lips exploring with a care that left me breathless. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive. Afterward, we lay tangled together beneath the soft glow of the bedside lamp. Andrew's arm was draped over me, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice low and soothing. I nodded, my head resting against his chest. "Better than okay," I said, though my voice wavered with the weight of what had just happened. He pressed a kiss to my temple, his hold on me tightening. "I meant what I said," he murmured. "This is real, Evelyn. I'm not going anywhere." As comforting as his words were, the reality of what we'd done began to settle over me. The weight of it pressed down on me, making it harder to breathe. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to figure it out right now," he said, his hand brushing against my cheek. "We'll take it one step at a time." His reassurance eased some of the tension in my chest, but the questions swirling in my mind refused to quiet. What would people say if they found out? What would happen if this all fell apart? And yet, despite the fear, there was something else, a flicker of hope that made it impossible to regret what had happened. When morning came, the sunlight streaming through the curtains felt brighter than usual. Andrew stirred beside me, his arm tightening around my waist as he pulled me closer. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning," I replied, though my voice trembled slightly. He leaned down, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "You okay?" "I think so," I said, though the truth was far more complicated than I could put into words. After Andrew left that morning, I stood in the quiet of the house, the memory of his touch still lingering on my skin. The house felt different now, both emptier and fuller all at once. I knew we'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and the weight of that realization was almost suffocating. But beneath the fear and doubt, there was something else. Something wonderful. The morning after Andrew left, the house felt unnervingly still. I moved through my routine on autopilot, making coffee, tidying up, and trying to ignore the lingering scent of his cologne on the pillow beside mine. I told myself I needed to think, to make sense of everything that had happened. But every time I tried to focus, my mind returned to the way he'd held me, the way he'd whispered my name like it was something sacred. By mid-afternoon, I had nearly convinced myself that putting distance between us would be the right thing to do. I had spent years carefully maintaining the balance of my life, keeping my emotions neatly contained. Letting Andrew in threatened to unravel all of that. But as I stared out the kitchen window, watching the wind sway the branches of the oak tree in the yard, my phone buzzed on the counter. "Andrew, are you okay?" A simple question. One that carried so much weight. I stared at the message for a long moment before typing a reply. "Me? I don't know." That evening, Andrew showed up unannounced. I opened the door to find him standing there, his expression a mix of hope and worry. "Hi," he said softly. "Hi," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. We moved to the living room. The tension between us palpable. Andrew sat on the edge of the couch, his elbows resting on his knees as he watched me. "I've been thinking about us," he said after a moment, his voice steady but quiet. "And?" I asked, my chest tightening. "I don't regret what happened," he said firmly. "Not a single moment of it." His words sent a jolt through me, and I sank into the armchair across from him. "Andrew, this isn't just about us," I said, my voice trembling. "There are so many things to consider. What would people think? What would they say?" "Why does it matter what they think?" he countered, his tone laced with frustration. "This is our life, Evelyn, not theirs." His certainty both comforted and terrified me. I looked away, my fingers twisting in my lap. "It's not that simple," I whispered. "Maybe it can be," he said, leaning forward. "If we let it be." I met his gaze, and the intensity in his eyes made my breath catch. "What if this doesn't work?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "What if it does?" he replied, his voice soft but insistent. "What if this is exactly what we both need?" The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over us. Andrew stood, crossing the space between us in a few quick steps. He knelt in front of me, his hands covering mine. "I know you're scared," he said gently, "but you don't have to face this alone. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." His words broke through the walls I'd spent years building, and tears filled my eyes. "I don't want to lose you," I admitted, my voice cracking. "You won't," he said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere." Before I could second-guess myself, I leaned forward, wrapping my arms around him. He held me tightly, his hands stroking my back as I buried my face in his shoulder. For the first time in years, I let myself feel everything. The fear, the doubt, the longing, and the undeniable pull toward him. When I finally pulled back, Andrew cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears on my cheeks. "I'm all in, Evelyn," he said softly, "but I need to know if you are too." Instead of answering, I kissed him. The kiss was slow at first, tentative, but it quickly deepened, growing more urgent as the weight of our emotions spilled over. Andrew lifted me effortlessly, carrying me to the couch as his lips never left mine. Every touch, every kiss felt like a reassurance, a reminder that we weren't alone, that we didn't have to carry the weight of our doubts and fears by ourselves. The hours that followed were a blur of warmth and connection. Andrew was patient, his hands gentle as he explored every inch of me, his lips murmuring soft reassurances that made my chest ache with something that felt dangerously close to hope. For the first time in years, I let myself believe that I deserved this, that I deserved him. Later, as we lay tangled together on the couch, the room bathed in the soft glow of the table lamp, I felt a strange mix of peace and unease. Andrew's arm was draped over my shoulders, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice low and soothing. I nodded, though my thoughts were a whirlwind. "I think so," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to figure everything out right now," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. "We'll take it one step at a time." His reassurance eased some of the tension in my chest, but the reality of our situation was impossible to ignore. The next morning, Andrew stayed for breakfast. We sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and sharing quiet smiles. It felt almost normal, like any other day. But as he left, pressing a lingering kiss to my forehead before walking out the door, the weight of what we'd done began to settle over me. What if someone found out? What would they say? And yet, beneath the fear and uncertainty, there was something else. Something I couldn't quite name but knew I didn't want to lose. That afternoon, Andrew sent me a message. "Andrew, I know this isn't easy, but I'm here. Always." I stared at the message for a long time before typing a reply. I know, thank you. As I hit send, I felt a flicker of hope, a fragile, tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, we could make this work. The following days were a blur of quiet reflection and whispered moments between Andrew and me. He didn't push me, but his presence was constant, a steady reminder of the connection we had forged and the risks it carried. I spent hours pacing through the house, running my fingers along the familiar furniture, the framed photos on the walls, the little reminders of the life I had built here. It all felt like a tether, holding me back from stepping fully into this new chapter, yet also grounding me in a way I couldn't ignore. When I thought of Andrew, my chest filled with a mixture of warmth and fear. He had given me a glimpse of something I hadn't felt in years: freedom, joy, and the terrifying possibility of being truly seen. But the weight of what others might think, of what this relationship could cost us, lingered like a shadow over every moment of happiness. One evening, I sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson. The wineglass in my hand was half empty, and my thoughts swirled like the liquid in the glass. I didn't hear Andrew approach until he was standing in front of me, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Mind if I join you?" he asked softly. I nodded, and he sat down beside me, the swing creaking slightly under our combined weight. For a moment we didn't speak, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. "I've been thinking," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "About what?" he asked, turning to look at me. "About us," I admitted, my fingers tightening around the stem of the glass. Andrew nodded, his expression steady. And I don't know if I'm strong enough to do this," I said, my voice trembling. He reached for my hand, his fingers warm and steady against mine. "You are," he said firmly. "You're stronger than you think." I looked at him, my chest tightening at the certainty in his eyes. "What if people find out? What if they don't understand?" "They don't have to understand," he said softly. "This isn't about them, it's about us." His words settled over me like a balm, easing some of the tension in my chest. But the doubts still lingered, stubborn and unyielding. "What if this doesn't work?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "What if it does?" he replied, his tone filled with quiet hope. The simplicity of his answer caught me off guard, and for a moment I couldn't find the words to respond. Instead, I let myself lean into him, resting my head on his shoulder as the swing rocked gently beneath us. We sat like that for a long time, the sky darkening around us as the stars began to emerge. Andrew's hand remained steady on mine, his thumb brushing slow, soothing circles against my skin. "You don't have to decide everything tonight," he said finally, his voice low and soothing. "But I need you to know that I'm all in, Evelyn. Whatever it takes, I'm here." His words broke something inside me and tears filled my eyes. "I'm scared," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I know," he said, pulling me closer. "But you're not alone." The next morning, I woke with a strange sense of clarity. The doubts were still there, but they no longer felt insurmountable. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a choice. A real, honest choice about what I wanted my life to be. As I stood by the window, watching the sunlight filter through the trees, I realized that my fear wasn't about Andrew or what we had. It was about stepping into the unknown, about risking my carefully constructed world for the chance at something greater. And for the first time, I felt ready to take that step. When Andrew came over that evening, I met him at the door, my heart pounding as I pulled him inside. "Hi," he said softly, his hand brushing against mine. "Hi," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. We moved to the living room and Andrew sat on the couch, his expression a mix of hope and apprehension. "What's on your mind?" he asked. I took a deep breath, sitting down beside him. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," I said. And I don't want to live my life being afraid of what other people might think," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "I want to be happy. And you make me happy, Andrew." Relief washed over his face, and he reached for my hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "You make me happy too," he said softly. We sat together for a long time, the weight of the moment settling over us. It wasn't a perfect solution. There were still questions to answer, challenges to face, but for the first time, I felt like we could face them together. As the night stretched on, I let myself lean into the hope that had been quietly growing inside me. The future was uncertain, but it was ours to shape, one step at a time.